This is Chapter 43 of Pride and Prejudice, or Chapter 1 of Volume 3. Elizabeth, as they drove along, watched for the first appearance of Pemberley Woods with some perturbation, and when at length they turned in at the lodge, her spirits were in a high flutter. If you remember, Pemberley is Mr. Darcy's house. At this time in history, you could go and tour grand estates, even if people lived in those houses. Elizabeth asks one of the servants if Mr. Darcy or anyone in his family is around, and they say no, so she's safe to go see Pemberley with her aunt and uncle. The park was very large and contained great variety of ground. They entered it in one of its lowest points, and drove for some time through a beautiful wood stretching over a wide extent. Elizabeth's mind was too full for conversation, but she saw and admired every remarkable spot and point of view. They gradually ascended for half a mile, and then found themselves at the top of a considerable eminence, where the wood ceased, and the eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of a valley, into which the road with some abruptness wound. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing well on rising ground, and backed by a ridge of high woody hills, and in front a stream of some natural importance was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor forcefully adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration, and at that moment she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. So Elizabeth is admiring the grounds of this house and thinking, if she had married Mr. Darcy, she would have been mistress of this whole place, just, kind of in charge of everything, and it's a nice place to be in charge of. They descended the hill, crossed the bridge, and drove to the door, and while examining the nearer aspect of the house, all her apprehension of meeting its owner returned. She dreaded lest the chambermaid had been mistaken. On applying to see the place, they were admitted into the hall, and Elizabeth, as they waited for the housekeeper, had leisure to wonder at her being where she was. The housekeeper came, a respectable-looking elderly woman, much less fine and more civil than she had any notion of finding her. They followed her into the dining parlor. It was a large, well-proportioned room, handsomely fitted up. Elizabeth, after slightly surveying it, went to a window to enjoy its prospect. The hill, crowned with wood, from which they had descended, receiving increased abruptness from the distance, was a beautiful object. Every disposition of the ground was good, and she looked on the whole scene, the river, the trees scattered on its banks, and the winding of the valley, as far as she could trace it, with delight. As they passed into other rooms, these objects were taking different positions, but from every window there were beauties to be seen. The rooms were lofty and handsome, and their furniture suitable to the fortune of their proprietor. But Elizabeth saw, with admiration of his taste, that it was neither gaudy nor uselessly fine, with less of splendor and more real elegance than the furniture of Rosings. So Elizabeth really is liking Mr. Darcy's interior decorating. The furniture is elegant and classy without being too opulent or neat and just overwhelming. She likes it a lot better than Rosings, which makes perfect sense because Lady Catherine de Bourgh is a much more showy person than Mr. Darcy, although they are both proud characters. And of this place, thought she, I might have been mistress. With these rooms I might now have been familiarly acquainted. Instead of viewing them as a stranger, I might have rejoiced in them as my own, and welcomed to them as visitors my uncle and aunt. But no, recollecting herself, that could never be. My uncle and aunt would have been lost to me. I should not have been allowed to invite them. This was a lucky recollection. It saved her from something like regret. So Elizabeth is feeling a little bit sorry that she didn't marry Mr. Darcy now that she sees his fabulous house. She thinks about how she could have invited her uncle and aunt over and had them as guests if that were the case, but then she stops and thinks to herself, that wouldn't have happened because Mr. Darcy is condescending towards people of a lower social class, like her aunt and uncle, and they probably wouldn't have been allowed to visit. She longed to inquire of the housekeeper whether her master were really absent, but had not courage for it. At length, however, the question was asked by her uncle, and she turned away with alarm, while Mrs. Reynolds replied that he was, adding, but we expect him tomorrow with a large party of friends. How rejoiced was Elizabeth that their own journey had not by any circumstance been delayed a day. Her aunt now called her to look at a picture. She approached and saw the likeness of Mr. Wickham suspended among several other miniatures over the mantelpiece. Her aunt asked her smilingly how she liked it. So remember, her aunt knows that she and Wickham had a little flirtation thing going on, so she's kind of like joking with Elizabeth. The housekeeper came forward and told them it was the picture of a young gentleman, the son of her late master's steward, who had been brought up by him at his own expense. He has now gone into the army, she added, but I'm afraid he has turned out very wild. So we get some confirmation from Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Darcy's housekeeper, that Wickham is indeed a bad guy. Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece with a smile, but Elizabeth could not return it. So we have a little dramatic irony going on there. Remember, Mrs. Gardiner does not know that Wickham is a truly terrible man, but Elizabeth does, and so do we. And that, said Mrs. Reynolds, pointing to another of the miniatures, is my master, and very like him. It was drawn at the same time as the other, about 8 years ago. I have heard much of your master's fine person, said Mrs. Gardiner, looking at the picture. It is a handsome face. But, Lizzie, can you tell us whether it is like or not? Mrs. Reynolds' respect for Elizabeth seemed to increase on this intimation of her knowing her master. Does that young lady know Mr. Darcy? Elizabeth colored and said, a little. And do you not think him a very handsome gentleman, ma'am? Yes, very handsome. I am sure I know none so handsome, but in the gallery upstairs you will see a finer, larger picture of him than this. This room was my late master's favorite room, and these miniatures are just as they used to be then. He was very fond of them. This accounted to Elizabeth for Mr. Wickham's being among them. So these pictures, these miniature portraits, are of Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham, and this was the deceased Mr. Darcy's room. So our Mr. Darcy's father, which explains why Wickham was here, because Mr. Darcy Sr. did genuinely like Wickham. Mrs. Reynolds then directed their attention to one of Miss Darcy, drawn when she was only 8 years old. And is Miss Darcy as handsome as her brother? Said Mr. Gardiner. Oh yes, the handsomest young lady that ever was seen, and so accomplished, she plays and sings all day long. In the next room is a new instrument just come down for her, a present from my master. She comes here tomorrow with him. What a nice brother Mr. Darcy is, gets his sister a whole piano. Mr. Gardiner, whose manners were easy and pleasant, encouraged her communicativeness by his questions and remarks. Mrs. Reynolds, either from pride or attachment, had evidently great pleasure in talking of her master and his sister. Is your master much at Pemberley in the course of the year? Not so much as I could wish, sir, but I dare say he may spend half his time here, and Miss Darcy is always down for the summer months. Except, thought Elizabeth, when she goes to Ramsgate. And Ramsgate was where the whole Wickham trying to elope with her to take her money happened. If your master would marry, you might see more of him. Yes, sir, but I do not know when that will be. I do not know who is good enough for him. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner smiled. Elizabeth could not help saying, it is very much to his credit, I am sure, that you should think so. I say no more than the truth, and what everybody will say that knows him, replied the other. Elizabeth thought this was going pretty far, and she listened with increasing astonishment as the housekeeper added, I have never had a cross word from him in my life, and I have known him ever since he was 4 years old. This was praise of all others most extraordinary, most opposite to her ideas. That he was not a good-tempered man had been her firmest opinion. Her keenest attention was awakened. She longed to hear more, and was grateful to her uncle for saying, there are very few people of whom so much can be said. You are lucky in having such a master. Yes, sir, I know I am. If I were to go through the world, I could not meet with a better. But I have always observed that they who are good-natured when children are good-natured when they grow up, and he was always the sweetest-tempered, most generous-hearted boy in the world. Elizabeth almost stared at her. Can this be Mr. Darcy? Thought she. His father was an excellent man, said Mrs. Gardiner. Yes, ma'am, that he was indeed, and his son will be just like him, just as affable to the poor. Elizabeth listened, wondered, doubted, and was impatient for more. Mrs. Reynolds could interest her on no other point. She related the subjects of the pictures, the dimensions of the rooms, and the price of the furniture in vain. Mr. Gardiner, highly amused by the kind of family prejudice to which he attributed her excessive commendation of her master, soon led again to the subject, and she dwelt with energy on his many merits as they proceeded together up the great staircase. So you are kind of getting through these characters a few different perspectives. So the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, is very generous and positive when she's talking about Mr. Darcy. She says that he was a sweet-tempered boy, and she's known him since he was a young child. She says that he's kind, that he's generous, that he's good to the poor, that she's never had a cross word from him. Elizabeth is doubting that because we know him as a very kind of surly, almost grumpy man. So she's wondering if that can be true. And something to consider as you read this chapter is think about how people sometimes act differently when they're at their own homes and when they're out in public, especially with what we know about Mr. Darcy being sort of a more reserved, shy person, that may explain some of his differences of personality to these different people. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner are not really Mr. Darcy fans. They don't know what was in the contents of that letter he wrote Elizabeth. So they don't know about his, the hardships with Wickham. They don't know about some of his other motivations. They don't really know him that well. They kind of smile when Mrs. Reynolds is praising him with that, like, a knowing sort of doubtful, really smile. So when she says, I don't know who's good enough to marry Mr. Darcy, they think that's a load of baloney. But it may be coming from a real place. She may not just be saying that. So she could just be very proud of her position, Mrs. Reynolds, or she could truly feel from knowing Mr. Darcy so long that he is that generous and good of a person. So something to think about, and you'll notice that you have still those different characters' perspectives in this chapter. He is the best landlord and the best master, said she, that ever lived, not like the wild young men nowadays who think of nothing but themselves. There is not one of his tenants or servants but will give him a good name. Some people call him proud, but I am sure I never saw anything of it. To my fancy, it is only because he does not rattle away like other young men. What an amiable light does this place him, thought Elizabeth. This fine account of him, whispered her aunt as they walked, is not quite consistent with his behavior to our poor friend. She's referring to Wickham there. Perhaps we might be deceived. That is not very likely. Our authority was too good. On reaching the spacious lobby above, they were shown into a very pretty sitting room, lately fitted up with greater elegance and lightness than the apartments below, and were informed that it was but just done to give pleasure to Miss Darcy, who had taken a liking to the room when last at Pemberley. He certainly is a good brother. He is certainly a good brother, said Elizabeth as she walked towards one of the windows. Mrs. Reynolds anticipated Miss Darcy's delight when she should enter the room. And this is always the way with him, she added. Whatever he can give his sister any pleasure is sure to be done in a moment. There is nothing he would not do for her. The picture gallery and 2 or 3 of the principal bedrooms were all that remained to be shown. In the former were many good paintings, but Elizabeth knew nothing of the art, and from such as had been already visible below, she had willingly turned to look at some drawings of Miss Darcy's, in crayons, whose subjects were usually more interesting and also more intelligible. In the gallery there were many family portraits, but they could have little to fix the attention of a stranger. Elizabeth walked on in quest of the only face whose features would be known to her. At last it arrested her, and she beheld a striking resemblance of Mr. Darcy, with such a smile over the face as she remembered to have sometimes seen when he looked at her. She stood several minutes before the picture in earnest contemplation, and returned to it again before they quitted the gallery. Mrs. Reynolds informed them that it had been taken in his father's lifetime. There was certainly at this moment, in Elizabeth's mind, a more gentle sensation towards the original than she had ever felt in the height of their acquaintance. The commendation bestowed on him by Mrs. Reynolds was of no trifling nature. What praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? As a brother, a landlord, a master, she considered how many people's happiness were in his guardianship, how much of pleasure or pain it was in his power to bestow, how much of good or evil must be done by him. Every idea that had been brought forward by the housekeeper was favorable to his character, and as she stood before the canvas on which he was represented, and fixed his eyes upon herself, she thought of his regard with a deeper sentiment of gratitude than it had ever raised before. She remembered its warmth and softened its impropriety of expression. So Elizabeth is thinking better of Mr. Darcy than she has really ever before in the past. When all of the house that was open to general inspection had been seen, they returned downstairs, and taking leave of the housekeeper, were consigned over to the gardener, who met them at the hall door. As they walked across the lawn towards the river, Elizabeth turned back to look again. Her uncle and aunt stopped also, and while the former was conjecturing as to the date of the building, the owner of it himself suddenly came forward from the road which led behind it to the stables. The owner of it is Mr. Darcy. So they're looking back at the house. The former, so Elizabeth's uncle, is guessing about the date of the building, so how old the building was, and then Mr. Darcy's walking up the road toward them. They were within 20 yards of each other, and so abrupt was his appearance that it was impossible to avoid his sight. Their eyes instantly met, and the cheeks of each were overspread with the deepest blush. He absolutely started, and for a moment seemed immovable from surprise, but shortly recovering himself, advanced towards the party and spoke to Elizabeth, if not in terms of perfect composure, at least of perfect civility, So Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy both blush. He goes over and talks to them, and while he's not completely put together, he's not so composed, he's very civil, he's very polite. She had instinctively turned away, but stopping on his approach, received his compliments with an embarrassment impossible to be overcome. Had his first appearance, or his resemblance to the picture they had just been examining, been insufficient to assure the other two that they now saw Mr. Darcy, the gardener's expression of surprise on beholding his master must immediately have told it. They stood a little aloof while he was talking to their niece, who, astonished and confused, scarcely dared lift her eyes to his face, and knew not what answer she returned to his civil inquiries after her family. Amazed at the alteration of his manner since they last parted, every sentence that he uttered was increasing her embarrassment, and every idea of the impropriety of her being found there recurring to her mind, the few minutes in which they continued together were some of the most uncomfortable of her life. Nor did he seem much more at ease. When he spoke, his accent had none of its usual sedateness, and he repeated his inquiries as to the time of her having left Longbourn, and of her stay in Derbyshire, so often, and in so hurried a way, as plainly spoke the distraction of his thoughts. So Mr. Darcy's pretty distracted by the fact that they're there. Elizabeth's extremely embarrassed. Also, it's really weird and impolite, that's what that impropriety means, that she's walking around his house and seeing what's there. It seems almost like a little bit like nosy and prying, if not maybe a little bit of wondering what she was wondering before, what would it be like to marry Mr. Darcy and live at Pemberley. So it's very uncomfortable for both of them. Very awkward. At length, every idea seemed to fail him, and after standing a few moments without saying a word, he suddenly recollected himself and took leave. So there's a more awkward pause where he runs out of things to say, and then he just leaves. Well, he takes leave, so he excuses himself to go. He doesn't just, walk away. The others then joined her and expressed their admiration of his figure, but Elizabeth heard not a word, and wholly engrossed by her own feelings, followed them in silence. She was overpowered by shame and vexation. Her coming there was the most unfortunate, the most ill-judged thing in the world. How strange it must appear to him. In what a disgraceful light might it not strike so vain a man? It might seem as if she had purposely thrown herself in his way again. Oh, why did she come? Or why did he thus come a day before he was expected? Had they been only 10 minutes sooner, they should have been beyond the reach of his discrimination. For it was plain that he was that moment arrived, that moment alighted from his horse or his carriage. She blushed again and again over the perverseness of the meeting, and his behavior so strikingly altered. What could it mean? That he should even speak to her was amazing, but to speak with such civility, to inquire after her family. Never in her life had she seen his manners so little dignified. Never had he spoken with such gentleness as on this unexpected meeting. What a contrast did it offer to his last address in Rosings Park, when he put his letter into her hand. She knew not what to think, or how to account for it. So Elizabeth is very surprised. She feels like this is incredibly awkward. She thinks it's so foolish that they went to the house now. But she's surprised that Mr. Darcy was so polite and kind. When she says he's not dignified, she doesn't mean that he's behaving in a bad way or an impolite way, but that he's not so stuck up as he was before, and the way that he speaks to her is very pleasant, and not at all the usual very proud, almost rude Mr. Darcy that we've read about in past chapters. They had now entered a beautiful walk by the side of the water, and every step was bringing forward a nobler fall of ground, or a finer reach of the woods to which they were approaching. But it was some time before Elizabeth was sensible of any of it, and though she answered mechanically to the repeated appeals of her uncle and aunt, and seemed to direct her eyes to such objects as they pointed out, she distinguished no part of the scene. Her thoughts were all fixed on that one spot of Pemberley House, whichever it might be, where Mr. Darcy then was. She longed to know what at that moment was passing in his mind, in what manner he thought of her, and whether, in defiance of everything, she was still dear to him. Perhaps he had been civil only because he felt himself at ease, yet there had been that in his voice which was not like ease. Whether he had felt more of pain or of pleasure in seeing her, she could not tell, but he certainly had not seen her with composure. So they're still continuing their tour of the grounds of Pemberley, but Elizabeth's not able to concentrate on anything she sees. All she's thinking about is where Mr. Darcy is and what he must think of her for coming. She wonders if he was annoyed, if he still cares about her. She knows that however he views her, he wasn't put together when they spoke. At length, however, the remarks of her companions on her absence of mind roused her, and she felt the necessity of appearing more like herself. They entered the woods, and bidding adieu to the river for a while, ascended some of the higher grounds, whence, in spots where the opening of the trees gave the eye power to wander, were many charming views of the valley, the opposite hills, with a long range of woods overspreading many, and occasionally part of the stream. Mr. Gardiner expressed a wish of going round the whole park, but feared it might be beyond a walk. With a triumphant smile they were told that it was 10 miles round. It settled the matter, and they pursued the accustomed circuit, which brought them again, after some time, in a descent among hanging woods, to the edge of the water and one of its narrowest parts. They crossed it by a simple bridge, in character with the general air of the scene. It was a spot less adorned than any they had yet visited, and this valley, where here contracted into a glen, allowed room only for the stream, and a narrow walk amidst the rough coppice wood which it bordered. Elizabeth longed to explore its windings, but when they had crossed the bridge and perceived their distance from the house, Mrs. Gardiner, who was not a great walker, could go no farther, and thought only of returning to the carriage as quickly as possible. Her niece was therefore obliged to submit, and they took their way towards the house on the opposite side of the river, in the nearest direction. But their progress was slow, for Mr. Gardiner, though seldom able to indulge the taste, was very fond of fishing, and was so much engaged in watching the occasional appearance of some trout in the water, and talking to the man about them, that he advanced but little. Whilst wandering on in this slow manner, they were again surprised, and Elizabeth's astonishment was quite equal to what it had been at first, by the sight of Mr. Darcy approaching them, and at no great distance. The walk being here less sheltered than on the other side, allowed them to see him before they met. Elizabeth, however astonished, was at least more prepared for an interview than before, and resolved to appear and to speak with calmness, if he really intended to meet them. For a few moments, indeed, she felt that he would probably strike into some other path. The idea lasted while a turning in the walk concealed him from their view. The turning past, he was immediately before them. With a glance she saw that he had lost none of his recent civility, and, to imitate his politeness, she began as they met to admire the beauty of the place. But she had not got beyond the words delightful and charming, when some unlucky recollections obtruded, and she fancied that praise Pemberley from her might be mischievously construed. Her colour changed, and she said no more. So they continue walking on. Mrs. Gardiner gets kind of tired. They think they can walk around all of Pemberley. Mrs. Gardiner gets tired, so they have to kind of double back. Mr. Gardiner is an avid fisher, so he stops to look at all the fishing locations on the grounds, and then as they're walking, they run into Mr. Darcy again. So Elizabeth decides that she's going to be composed and calm, and that she's also going to be just as polite as he was and admire the beauty of the grounds. But then she thinks, maybe that isn't such a good idea to praise how beautiful this place is, because it may look like she's after it, like she's trying to like catch him or something like that, so that she may be trying to win him back and then live in just his nice fancy house and beautiful grounds. Mrs. Gardiner was standing a little behind, and on her pausing, he asked her if she would do him the honor of introducing him to her friends. This was a stroke of civility for which she was quite unprepared, and she could hardly suppress a smile at his being now seeking the acquaintance of some of those very people against whom his pride had revolted in his offer to herself. What will be his surprise, thought she, when he knows who they are? He takes them now for people of fashion. So again, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner have earned their living, so they're not as high class as Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth knows in the past that he expressed doubt about their family's eligibility and background when he broke up Bingley and Jane, and that was one of his objections to proposing to Elizabeth, was that her family had, according to him, not the greatest background. And now he's asking to be introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. So Elizabeth thinks, wow, he's going to be really surprised when he finds out who they are and that they're not as upper class as he is. The introduction, however, was immediately made, and as she named their relationship to herself, she stole a sly look at him to see how he bore it, and it was not without the expectation of his decamping as fast as he could from such disgraceful companions. That he was surprised by the connection was evident. He sustained it, however, with fortitude, and so far from going away, turned back with them and entered into conversation with Mr. Gardiner. Elizabeth could not but be pleased, could not but triumph. It was consoling that he should know she had some relations for whom there was no need to blush. She listened most attentively to all that passed between them, and gloried in every expression, since every sentence of her uncle, which marked his intelligence, his taste, or his good manner. Oh, sorry, and every sentence of her uncle, I said every sentence. Every sentence of her uncle, which marked his intelligence, his taste, or his good manners. So Elizabeth doesn't know how this meeting is going to go. She's a little bit worried that Mr. Darcy will just walk away or do something rude when he finds out who they are. But he doesn't. He walks back with them and starts talking to Mr. Gardiner, and the conversation seems to be going very well. And everything that Mr. Gardiner says shows that he's a pretty polite, knowledgeable person. The conversation soon turned upon fishing, and she heard Mr. Darcy invite him, with the greatest civility, to fish there as often as he chose, while he continued in the neighbourhood, offering at the same time to supply him with fishing tackle, and pointing out those parts of the stream where there was usually most sport. Mrs. Gardiner, who was walking arm in arm with Elizabeth, gave her a look expressive of her wonder. Elizabeth said nothing, but it gratified her exceedingly. The compliment must be all for herself. Her astonishment, however, was extreme, and continually she was repeating, "Why is he so altered? From what can it proceed? It cannot be for me, it cannot be for my sake that his manners are thus softened. My reproofs at Hunsford could not work such a change as this. It is impossible that he should still love me." So it's going well, and Mr. Darcy even invites Mr. Gardiner to come fish on his property whenever he would like, as long as they're in this area. Elizabeth feels happy about that, but she's also quite shocked by this. She doesn't know what made Mr. Darcy change from his usual proud, obnoxious manner and why he's being this polite and kind, and she thinks it can't possibly be because of the things that she said to him. After walking some time in this way, the two ladies in front, the two gentlemen behind, on resuming their places after descending to the brink of the river for the better inspection of some curious water plant, there chanced to be a little alteration. It originated in Mrs. Gardiner, who, fatigued by the exercise of the morning, found Elizabeth's arm quite inadequate to her support, and consequently preferred her husband's. So Mrs. Gardiner's getting tired, she can't lean on Elizabeth and has to lean on Mr. Gardiner. Mr. Darcy took her place by her niece, and they walked on together. After a short silence, the lady first spoke. She wished him to know that she had been assured of his absence before she came to the place, and accordingly began by observing that his arrival had been very unexpected. "For your housekeeper," she added, "informed us that you would certainly not be here till tomorrow, and indeed, before we left Bakewell, we understood that you were not immediately expected in the country." He acknowledged the truth of it all, and said that business with his steward had occasioned his coming forward a few hours before the rest of the party with whom he had been travelling. "They will join me early tomorrow," he continued, "and among them are some who will claim an acquaintance with you, Mr. Bingley and his sisters." So Elizabeth kind of, without really saying she's sorry, she basically apologizes for being there. She said, she tells Mr. Darcy she thought he was not going to be in his house and that he was not going to be around, and basically that she wouldn't have come if she had known, because it's an awkward situation. Mr. Darcy says, "No, you're right. I did mean to. I was going to come tomorrow." He comes early to take care of some business matters, but tomorrow Mr. Bingley and his sisters are also coming to Pemberley. Elizabeth answered only by a slight bow. Her thoughts were instantly driven back to the time when Mr. Bingley's name had been last mentioned between them, and if she might judge from his complexion, his mind was not very differently engaged. So thinking back to the proposal, which goes horribly, and how Elizabeth tells him that he was a bad person for breaking up Bingley and Jane. "There's also one other person in the party," he continued after a pause, "who more particularly wishes to be known to you. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to your acquaintance during your stay at Lambton?" The surprise of such an application was great indeed. It was too great for her to know in what manner she acceded to it. She immediately felt that whatever desire Miss Darcy might have of being acquainted with her must be the work of her brother, and without looking farther, it was satisfactory. It was gratifying to know that his resentment had not made him think really ill of her. So Mr. Darcy then asks her if she'll meet his sister, Georgiana. Elizabeth is very surprised by this, but she's not unhappy about this development, and she thinks, well, if Georgiana Darcy wants to meet her, it must be Mr. Darcy talking about Elizabeth that created that interest, because Elizabeth doesn't know her otherwise. So that's kind of nice. So she knows that Mr. Darcy does not hate her. They now walked on in silence, each of them deep in thought. Elizabeth was not comfortable. That was impossible, but she was flattered and pleased. Her wish of introducing his sister to her was a compliment of the highest kind. They soon outstripped the others, and when they had reached the carriage, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were half a quarter of a mile behind. He then asked her to walk into the house, but she declared herself not tired, and they stood together on the lawn. At such a time, much might have been said, and silence was very awkward. She wanted to talk, but there seemed an embargo on every subject. At last she recollected that she had been travelling, and they talked of Matlock and Dovedale with great perseverance. Yet time and her aunt moved slowly, and her patience and her ideas were nearly worn out before the tete-a-tete was over. On Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner's coming up, they were all pressed to go into the house and take some refreshment, but this was declined, and they parted on each side with the utmost politeness. Mr. Darcy handed the ladies into the carriage, and when it drove off, Elizabeth saw him walking slowly towards the house. So Elizabeth and Darcy reach the house before Elizabeth's aunts and uncles, so they have a little bit of an alone moment. There's an awkward silence, and then Elizabeth suddenly remembers that she's been traveling, and she can talk about traveling, and they talk about the region with great perseverance. So they're very focused on just making small talk and talking about the travels that Elizabeth has been on. And they go into the carriage and they leave, and it's fairly smooth. The observations of her uncle and aunt now began, and each of them pronounced him to be infinitely superior to anything they had expected. "He is perfectly well behaved, polite, and unassuming," said her uncle. So they've heard that Mr. Darcy is really proud, and he is not really proud when he meets with them, so they're pretty shocked, the Gardiners. "There is something a little stately in him, to be sure," replied her aunt, "but it is confined to his air, and is not unbecoming. I can now say with the housekeeper that though some people may call him proud, I have seen no thing to it. I was never more surprised than by his behaviour to us. It was more than civil, it was really attentive, and there was no necessity for such attention. His acquaintance with Elizabeth was very trifling." More dramatic irony there. We know that he asked her to marry him, so that's not a trifling acquaintance. "To be sure, Lizzie," said her aunt, "he is not so handsome as Wickham, or rather he is not Wickham's countenance, for his features are perfectly good. But how came you to tell us that he was so disagreeable?" Elizabeth excused herself as well as she could, said that she had liked him better when they met in Kent than before, and that she had never seen him so pleasant as this morning. "But perhaps he may be a little whimsical in his civilities," replied her uncle. "Your great men often are, and therefore I shall not take him at his word about fishing, as he might change his mind another day, and warn me off his grounds." Elizabeth felt that they had entirely mistaken his character, but said nothing. So her uncle says, I don't know if I can take him seriously, that he really wants me to come fishing. I'm not going to take him up on that offer. I think he's just being whimsical, just, saying it to say it and not really meaning it. But Elizabeth disagrees. She thinks that they've mistaken him and overestimated his pride. "From what we have seen of him," continued Mrs. Gardiner, "I really should not have thought that he could have behaved in so cruel a way by anybody, as he has done by poor Wickham. He has not an ill-natured look. On the contrary, there's something pleasing about his mouth when he speaks, and there's something of dignity in his countenance that would not give one an unfavourable idea of his heart. But, to be sure, the good lady who showed us the house did give him a most flaming character. I could hardly help laughing aloud sometimes. But he is a liberal master, I suppose, and that, in the eye of a servant, comprehends every virtue." So Mrs. Gardiner is surprised by what the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, said about Mr. Darcy. She thinks that she's just kind of overselling him, that she's building up Mr. Darcy. He's probably just good to her as a servant, and that's why she's so effusive and kind and flowing with her praise. Elizabeth here felt herself called on to say something in vindication of his behaviour to Wickham, and therefore gave him to understand, in as guarded a manner as she could, that by what she had heard from his relations in Kent, his actions were capable of a very different construction, and that his character was by no means so faulty, nor Wickham so amiable, as they had been considered in Hertfordshire. In confirmation of this, she related the particulars of all the pecuniary transactions in which they had been connected, without actually naming her authority, but stating it to be such as might be relied on. So Elizabeth can't tell them the whole Wickham backstory drama, but she does, in a very guarded, careful way, say that Mr. Darcy may have acted in a more acceptable and reasonable way, and Wickham may have been more nasty and not as kind as we thought when we were back in Hertfordshire. And she can't tell who she got this information from, but she says that it's someone to be relied on. Mrs. Gardiner was surprised and concerned, but as they were now approaching the scene of her former pleasures, every idea gave way to the charm of recollection, and she was too much engaged in pointing out to her husband all the interesting spots in its environs to think of anything else. Fatigued as she had been by the morning's walk, they had no sooner dined than she set off again in quest of her former acquaintance, and the evening was spent in the satisfactions of an intercourse renewed after many years' discontinuance. So Mrs. Gardiner eventually drops the subject and thinks about her past, and they meet up with some of Mrs. Gardiner's old friends from when she used to live in Derbyshire. The occurrences of the day were too full of interest to leave Elizabeth much attention for any of these new friends, and she could do nothing but think, and think with wonder, of Mr. Darcy's civility, and, above all, of his wishing her to be acquainted with his sister. So Elizabeth is not paying attention to these new people she's meeting. She's just thinking about everything that passed between her and Mr. Darcy, and she's thinking about meeting Georgiana in the near future. And that's chapter 43.